We've been talking about sampling, samples, finding samples, doing stuff with samples, this whole unit. Now we're actually going to talk about different ways of getting those samples. Start with the good ones, and then we'll get into the bad ones. Okay? So let's get into it. So we want to survey SPSCC students on how much they pay for housing each month. That's going to be numerical data, going to be discrete, because we could round it to the nearest cent. And we're going to give an example for each type of sampling for asking those SPSCC students. So we're going to start with the simplest, the census. So a census is just getting data from everybody. Your sample is the population. So there's no choosing. If you're taking a census, there's no randomness about it. There's no choosing. It's just we ask everybody. We get data from everybody. So maybe when you sign up for classes, when a student registers, they have to input their height. Or sorry, we're not on height anymore. They input their housing costs, which would probably not fly. But here we go. For the example, that's what it would look like. We're getting data from everybody. That's what a census is. Simple random sample is another very common one. It's great because it is random, but it can be a little tedious to do sometimes. Simple random sample is a truly random, and that's important. Truly random, and mathematically when we say random, it's different from how colloquially we say random. It's different from how we normally talk about the word random in day-to-day life, but truly random selection. Another way of defining this is any sample is equally likely to occur. That's a more precise definition. You can just stick with this definition mostly, but if you want the precise definition, it's there below it. So we could use a random number generator to do this. Could use a random number generator to select students. Let's say we select 50 students. I don't know. Okay, or we could put all the students' names in a big hat. There's a lot of students, so it'd have to be a really big hat. And then we pick a name, mix it all up, pick a name, mix it all up. That'd be simple random too. Stratified and cluster are both similar because they both involve us putting things into groups. Okay, so we're going to start these definitions with the same phrasing. So first we're going to, step one, separate the population into groups. These groups are called strata. For cluster sampling, that's also how we start. Although for cluster sampling, we separate them into groups, but these groups are called clusters. We're very creative with our terminology, I know. Now, the difference here between stratified and cluster is what we do next. The stratified takes some from each group. Takes some from each group. And technically, it's a proportional amount. So if it's a small group, we'll take not very many. If it's a big group, we take more. Whereas cluster takes all from some groups. So notice that stratified and cluster are very similar in their definitions, but practicality, they're very, very different. So if we could visualize this, right? We visualize it. Let's say we have 4 groups. So both of these are dividing them into 4 groups. Well, stratified says, let's look at some from each group. We look at some here, some here, some here, some here as well. Whereas cluster says you're doing it everyone, but only from some groups. So maybe cluster sampling would look at all the people in this box and all the people in this box. Okay, so that's kind of the difference visualized between stratified and cluster. So what's an example that we could use to find housing costs for SPSCC students? Well, there's a bunch of ways that we could classify these students into groups. Okay, we could do these groups from socioeconomic backgrounds. We could do these groups based on reported race. We could do these groups based on pathway that they've chosen. And there could be reasons to choose each one. The idea for here is that stratified ensures representation. Simple random is just truly random. Stratified makes sure that we're getting people responses from each group. Okay. So let's say divide students by, sure, socioeconomic background. And then choose, then randomly select. So there is a simple random sample going on inside of this. Randomly select a proportionate amount, proportionate number from each background. Cluster will be similar. We could also divide them by socioeconomic background and choose every student from some backgrounds, or we could do a different cluster. The rationale behind choosing these is usually a little different. So for our cluster sample, let's say that we could divide students into pathways. What pathway are you pursuing? And then we need to choose a few random pathways. So let's maybe choose 3 random pathways. And survey all students in those pathways. Okay. To see the difference, right? Divide students into groups. And then we randomly selected a proportionate number from each group. Whereas cluster, we divided students into groups, and then we had to choose which random groups. We still had to randomly choose. So both of these still have random selection. Randomly choose the groups now, and once we choose the groups, we do everyone in those groups. Okay. The last two are a little quicker, a little easier to understand. Cluster and stratified are usually the trickiest. But systematic is going to be like ordering, some kind of ordering on a list. Then if we want to sample and choose like every ith person on that list. So for example, right, if we wanted 10 people in a list of 100, we'd need to choose every 10th person. Okay, so you do have to go through the whole list. And you also have to choose a random start. Okay, so you choose a random start based on whatever. It has to be random to start. And then it's every ith person on that list. So for our students, we could order students by student ID. whatever your student ID number is. And then let's say we have, if we have 6,000 students and want a sample of 100 of them, we'd choose every 60th. We're going to choose a random start. Then look or ask every 60th student on that list. Right? Because 60 times 100 equals 6,000. I won't say too much about multi-stage. I think we've kind of gotten enough here. Multi-stage is just combining the above. We'll take a sample and then we'll sample within that sample. All right. And you could come up with an explanation here. You could do a simple random sample to get 500 people, and then do a systematic sample of those 500 people to narrow it down further. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about is just watch out for some warnings. There are some biased methods that can be common. So bias is going to be a systematic failure to represent the population. Okay, we always want our samples to represent the population. And there's some kinds of sampling that's not going to represent the population. And that's not to say that you should never, ever do them, but you should be aware of what you're doing. Okay, so a sample is going to be biased if it does not represent population. And we can't really fix this data. So if we really care about biased data, again, if it's really informal and not that important data, go ahead and use these methods. But if it's meaningful data that we're going to make like policy decisions based off of or medical decisions based off of, then make sure to not use these. So it just depends on whether what you're doing is like, how important is it? Okay. So voluntary sampling, self-selected sampling is biased. Okay. So if we just, send out a survey, well, here's a great example. Here's a great example. If we just send out a survey to all of our students and say, what did you think about this class? That's a voluntary sample. The students choose to respond to that survey. Okay. We acknowledge it, but we do it because we don't want to force, I guess we could. We don't want to force students to take do these course evaluations. Okay. The respondent chooses, okay, to provide the data. Okay, so course evaluations. And one of the main reasons that these are biased is that it really, in general, it usually doesn't ever get the middle ground. Usually when you have voluntary sampling, you get the people who are really happy and the people who are really unhappy. Okay. But the people who are kind of in the middle, which by the way, the people who are kind of in the middle are the most important people for course evaluations. And the people who say, yeah, there was some good and some bad. That's the most important opinion in my biased opinion. Anyway. Okay. Because the people who are happy are usually just going to be generally happy, and the people who are upset are just going to be generally upset. So there's usually less important feedback there. But like the middle group tends to have a lot more nuanced feedback and very valuable. Anyway, so a lot of times, often has a skews towards extremes. One side or the other. Convenience sampling is just, sampling those who it's convenient to ask. It's in the name. Not random. I left this SPSCC student example, but let's come back to it for their housing costs. I could ask all my classes. You could say Jason could ask all of his classes. Ask all his students. Okay, which might not be representative of the population because the people who take a statistics class are going to be different in general than a typical SPSCC student, right? It's only certain pathways and stuff, which has other lurking variables in it as well. Or I could just, sit outside at lunch and ask people who go by. Which would be really weird. Imagine you're walking around at lunch and this guy walks up to you and says, "How much do you pay for housing every month?" Why do you want to know? But that would be an example of a convenient sample. All right, this video is long enough. Let's end it. Let me know if you have questions, and good luck.